Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to the 77th meeting of Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee, or COMSTAC. I am Brian Verna, the designated federal official or DFO responsible for compliance with the Federal Advisory Committee Act, under which this Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee is being conducted. This meeting is being held in accordance with a notice published in the Federal Register on October 19th, 2023. The agenda for the meeting was announced and the notice is posted on the COMSTAC website. As the DFO, it is my responsibility to ensure the agenda is followed and that accurate minutes are kept. I also have the responsibility to adjourn the meeting should I find it necessary to do so in the public interest. Only COMSTAC members may participate in any discussions and vote on matters put to a vote by the chair. And with that, I hand it over to Ms. Karina Dries, our chair.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much, Brian. I'm pleased to welcome you as the new COMSTAC DFO. We are delighted to work with you. I'll keep this very short. I look forward to today's discussion with members to both recap what we have accomplished thus far and to look toward the next year. I'm amazed by what this group has been able to accomplish given your many competing priorities. At the end of today's meeting, we'll discuss our proposed tasks for spring, and we want to ensure that you have ample time to work through these requests before our spring meeting. So we look forward to that discussion. Right now, it's my pleasure to introduce Michael O'Donnell, the Deputy Associate Administrator of FAA AST. At AST, Mr. O'Donnell directs AST's daily operations in overseeing and enabling safe space transportation. He has over 35 years of civil and military aviation experience, 15 of those years as a senior executive with the FAA. Mr. O'Donnell is a graduate of Embry-Riddle, where he is currently an adjunct professor. He's a private pilot, accredited airport executive, and has local, state, and federal government experience. Michael, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. Good to see you all. COMSTAC members, thank you for joining us today for the fall 2023 meeting. Here in the Office of Commercial Space Transportation, we very much appreciate this committee's commitment to the commercial space transportation industry and the time and talent each of you brings to COMSTAC. It's much appreciated. Together, I think we can ensure a bright future for space for generations to come as we in AST achieve our mission to ensure and enable safe space transportation. So as we approach the end of the calendar year of calendar year 23, I want to share some AST statistics with you. So in 23 alone, AST has licensed and overseen the safety of 104 operations, and we are projecting to reach a total of 120 operations by the end of the year. Compare that to 84 operations in calendar year 2022. Additionally, for those operations, we are on track to conduct over 700 inspections across the country. To date, we have completed 20 license modifications, 4 new license applications, and a whopping 35 projects in initial discussions and phases of licensing. Add that another 17 projects that are in the application phase. So with that, we've hired 31 people and have another 13 in various stages of the hiring process. This year, we released 2 advisory circulars. We put out 2 notice of proposed rulemakings, which are precursors to a rule, one on orbital debris, and the other to incorporate the Commercial Space Launch and Competitiveness Act. We have completed 2 LOX methane explosive yield tests in partnership with NASA and the DoD. More tests are coming. 1 contract has been awarded for AST's new License Electronic Application Portal, otherwise known as LEAP. We've also finished 12 of 14 spaceport security reviews. On the international front, we've held bilateral meetings with Saudi Arabia, South Korea, which is going on right now, and that's where Kelvin Coleman is, United Arab Emirates, Japan, Sweden, the UK, South Africa, Australia, the African Union Commission, Brazil, and the European Space Agency. And during 23, we've closed 5 mishap investigations, and we have 3 that are still open. While not all mishap investigations involve safety failures, understanding the mishap and implementing mitigations is critical to preventing future incidents. So this year, AST has also begun exploring opportunities with operators of new ways to share safety information. And today you'll hear more about that. It's definitely an exciting time to share these accomplishments and look at the numbers and the charts and the graphs to try to capture the industry's exponential growth. But the numbers don't always tell the whole story. Sometimes you have to look more closely to understand what they all mean. For example, there's been a lot of talk lately about the Part 450 regulation and the time and complexity of completing an application. To date, we've granted 4 launch operator licenses under CFR 14 CFR Part 450. But if you look more closely, you'll find more interesting story. Each of these 4 Part 450 applicants were for newly developed launch vehicles, all of which were still in development at the time of the application acceptance. The first one, Astra Rocket 3.1, although the 3rd version of the launch vehicle, it was the first version of an orbital rocket. The second one is ABL RS-1, or ABL's first launch. And then the 3rd one was Relativity's Terran 1, which debuted as the world's first completely 3D printed rocket, as you recall. And then also Starship Super Heavy from SpaceX, of course, the first version of the largest rocket ever built. So each of these license applications required substantial iterations throughout the review process. AST readily agrees that some of these were due to implementation of a new rule and working out what compliance looks like. But the timeline for review and the need for applicants to resubmit documentation was also due to a maturation process in the operator's safety processes and methods, particularly because these were all new vehicles. The FAA believes that future Part 450 evaluations will be completed in a timely way and welcomes feedback from the industry as we put our advisory circulars to support operators, host workshops, provide online training modules, and eventually roll out our licensed electronic applications portal, or LEAP. The move from prescriptive requirements to performance-based requirements does have a learning curve. We've seen that in the agency and other lines of business. And it's for all those involved, it's a learning curve, but it's designed to provide more flexibility and innovation, which is what the commercial space industry is all about. Confidence, risk-based analysis. I think together we can continue to embrace the change, experimentation, improvement, and most of all, collaboration. And we can maintain the strongest commercial space transportation sector in the world to benefit the American people and our nation's security and prosperity. So with that, I am pleased to introduce the Department of Transportation's Deputy Secretary, Holly Trottenberg. Holly.
Thanks, Michael. First of all, thanks for all your amazing leadership and work. And Brian, thank you too, and welcome and congratulations. It is really wonderful to get the chance. Some of you I've gotten to meet in person, but it's wonderful to meet the rest of you virtually. And I really appreciate you all giving me the chance to address what I think has been one of DOT and the FAA's oldest and most effective advisory councils, COMSTAC. You know, I think as Karina was pointing out, want to thank you all. I know you all, and I was looking through all your bios. This is an impressive group. And so I want to just say how much we appreciate the time and effort that you're putting into helping us as we advance commercial space and we do it safely with innovation, et cetera. Your time and participation are really appreciated. I want to thank some of the AST folks who aren't here. As you heard, Kelvin is abroad, but he's our fantastic leader. Karina, COMSTAC chair, thank you, and co-chair Mike French. So first of all, as you all know, there have been some wonderful changes at the FAA since I think the last time you all got together. We've had now our confirmed administrator, Mike Whitaker, back at the FAA. We're so thrilled to have him there. I know I see some hands going up. Thanks, Amanda. Obviously, he brings a wealth of experience, a huge amount of bipartisan and industry and stakeholder support, and he's already hit the ground running. And as you all know, he's joined by a remarkable deputy, Katie Thompson, who I had the chance to work closely with over the past 5 months, and your very own Ed Bolton, now as chief of staff. And I think that's going to be it's going to be a great team, but obviously Ed in particular is going to bring his deep experience and knowledge in commercial space, and I think really help our organization, and help us support and grow the industry safely. I think as Mike mentioned, I've gone back to just wearing my one hat, deputy secretary, but I really had quite an amazing experience as acting FAA administrator. And I like to joke now that every deputy secretary should take the opportunity to do that. I had been working in commercial space. I had done a lot of work with Kelvin and Michael and the whole team. And as you all know, as deputy secretary, got to participate in a lot of, I think, sort of the interagency parts of commercial space, working with the Vice President's Office and the Space Council, Department of Commerce, NASA, the White House Office of Science and Technology. A lot of collaboration, sometimes some spirited engagement, but I think also just a reminder of how this industry, as important as it is within aerospace, how much it touches on everything, including defense, and just how incredibly important your work is. I've talked to NASA more in the past couple of years than I've talked to them in all my roles put together in the past. I think just being at the FAA, it's just also been fun to see, just the excitement of the new modes of transportation out there, commercial space, AAM. I have to say your work has brought, I think, a new generation into the aviation world, and it's just been gratifying to see that. So just want to take just a couple minutes, some of my thoughts, perhaps, as someone who knew the FAA well, but obviously has now gotten a chance to see it from the inside, but maybe still has a bit of an outsider's perspective. It's an obvious point, and one that I don't think people make enough. When you look across the federal government, which I know pretty well, my conclusion is the FAA operates the most complex 24/7 operational system in the federal government, which makes it maybe the largest in the world. And just for me, one of the ways that was driven home, I don't know if any of you here have been to the FAA's command center. Has anyone been there in this group? Megan's been. If you haven't been, you should get a chance. And I don't know, you all can. When I went there, I have to say it kind of blew my mind to go in there and see, first of all, the dynamic map that's showing every flight and launches and everything else that's happening in our airspace. Second map showing the weather of the whole continental United States. There's always weather somewhere. The day I was there was literally some kind of equipment breakdown on a runway in San Francisco, and one of the tech ops folks was out there manually fixing it. And then, of course, I was up in the Challenger room looking at some of the work that's done for the most unbelievably sophisticated high-tech work with commercial space launches. So just the sheer breadth of what the FAA is doing is quite extraordinary. Look, secondly, and this won't surprise any of you, the chance to work more closely with the FAA workforce has just been amazing. I mean, what's fun about that agency is people have such a clear sense of mission. They have incredible expertise. I sometimes think they're too modest. I would frequently say to them, like, you are the biggest experts in the whole world. When you talk, people want to hear what you have to say. Extraordinarily dedicated. But it's no secret, we face challenges at the FAA. Leadership turnover, budgetary and staffing challenges, and of course, always operating at times under, very intense political and media scrutiny. I have to say this group consistently delivers, even with all those challenges ahead. But I know they also do it with the help of groups like yours and your expertise. So just a few kind of thoughts on places where calls to action, I would say. Look, obviously, we start with safety, and I know Michael gave you the statistics. In FY23, we're setting records, well over 100 launches. Back in 2018, there were 30. And we're continuing to do that safely, even as obviously, we haven't grown at that same pace. So, number one for all of us in working with you is how we keep that incredible safety track record. Number two, and I'm looking at Megan and others in this group that I've talked to, the continued assurance that FAA gets robust and stable and predictable funding. If we're going to maintain our safety record and grow with an industry, continue to be innovative, we need your help there too. And then I think Michael touched on it, innovation and efficiency. Look, I can just tell again, having perhaps seen it from the inside, I know the industry can feel like, this is a burdensome process. And I think you've heard from Michael, and one thing I've seen from him and Kelvin and the team, they are self-aware and I think spend a lot of time thinking in how they can do a better job. Michael talked about some of the things they're doing. There is a lot of focus on making our processes more predictable, repeatable, and less burdensome. But again, we're always going to have public safety as our North Star. And obviously, we'll always want your insights there. Let me just end with a note of gratitude for you all. Thanks for each and every member here. I guess I realize now that you have been one of our advisory committees for almost 4 decades. And that incredible continuity and thought leadership and partnership is something we really treasure. So want to continue working with you all. I'm back to my one hat, but count me a fan and a true believer on commercial space, and look forward to getting to hear about the discussion today. And I know between Michael and Brian and I, we're now happy to take some questions and have some discussion. I'll take the big picture questions. If it gets into aerospace engineering, I will certainly punt them to the aerospace engineers.
Thank you so much, Deputy Secretary. We so appreciate you joining us today, and we really appreciate your interest in commercial space and everything that this industry is working toward. Your team has been doing a fantastic job, as you mentioned, kind of given the limited resources, and we really appreciate all the work that they're doing. I totally agree. The FAA has very robust systems and a lot of work to be done to keep that perfect safety record. So AST is doing a really wonderful job given all that. I'm curious, as you obviously touched on the importance of space and how these companies play such an important role, not only for civil purposes, commercial purposes, but also national security. Where do you see FAA's role going forward with that sort of mandate to continue promoting the industry alongside the regulation piece?
Yeah, Karina, thank you. It's a great question, and I'll sort of broaden it. And I certainly want Michael to jump in here too. I mean, obviously, just as I was sort of joking about hearing a lot from NASA, obviously commercial space is fitting into, some very important larger, economic and geostrategic goals for the United States. And I would say, the old organizational thing, there's forming, storming, norming, and performing. We're doing a bit of forming and norming and storming about how the agencies are going to divide up the work. And as you know, another component of that is how commercial space works with the NTSB when we're looking at investigations. And here's hoping we won't have a lot of those, but we want to make sure, there's clear roles and responsibilities about how each of the federal agencies are going to work together. And look, I would say for now, it is something that we think a lot about in the aviation space, about regulator versus promoting and supporting an industry. And I just want to say, and I want Michael to jump in here, we are promoting and supporting this industry. We do think it's important for all the reasons we've discussed, but we're going to put safety first. And it's funny, sometimes I get this line like, the FAA needs to move at exactly the speed of Silicon Valley. And there's the move fast and break things motto, and I'm kind of the move fast and fix things motto. We do want to try and move fast and be innovative, but we're the public safety side of the house, so that is always going to be our top priority. But I don't know, Michael, we'll love your thoughts on it, actually.
Thank you, Polly and Karina. Good question. Being in the aviation side of the house for a long time, when FAA had the promotion and the regulation at the same time. The view was always, well, the promotion part for the agency was promoting safety. So if you promote safety, you promote the industry by promoting safety. And I think that's always been our focus, is that as we try to keep pace with industry, which is very hard to do, as Polly said, because we always got that safety component with us. But it's really about applying the regulations reasonably so that you can innovate and you can do things differently. One thing I learned in the difference between aviation and space is the tolerance for mishaps on the space side is it's a very different world. And I think educating the aviation industry, the importance of what happens with a mishap and how sometimes they are part of the growing is hard for the aviation people to understand. But on the space side, it's a part of growing because we're doing it safely. And that's what I mean by promoting the safety of what we do, to Polly's point, and that record we have. So regulation and promotion, to me, go hand in hand, because we promote the safety of it, and we want to be leaders in safety management systems on the space side and show the rest of the world how to do it. And I think that's how you promote. So that's how we're looking at it.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate those answers. George, go ahead.
Yes, Polly, thanks so much for your comments. You mentioned the importance of resources going forward. I think that is absolutely going to be vital in the future. We recently heard the Senate hearing on commercial space, during which some of the witnesses came right out and said, gosh, AST needs to have double the resources in terms of staffing and budget. Given the challenges with budget across the government these days, do you think that kind of a step increase is possible at some point going forward?
Well, George, thank you for the question. And look, just one thing that I have, again, in a way, because I have a perspective of transportation, which goes beyond aviation, and is kind of looking at all the other parts of the system. It's interesting, with the big infrastructure bill, we're making incredible investments in roads and bridges and transit and rail. As you've probably seen, the president and the secretary have just done an incredible series of announcements on rail investments in the Northeast Corridor. I don't think we made the commensurate investments that were needed on the aviation side. Put some investments into airports, but not into, I think, the bread and butter systems of the FAA. The staffing, the facilities and equipment, the things which are decidedly unsexy, but incredibly important. Now, I am encouraged by the fact that even in an appropriations process for this year, which is looking contentious, and those of you who may have followed the action on the House floor closely, they were unable, I think, to get the votes to pass the transportation and HUD FY24 appropriations bill. That bill, I think, had pretty good bipartisan consensus to support the FAA. Ironically, the way that they did that, because there were tight budget numbers, is they took a lot of the dollars out of other parts of the agency, particularly Amtrak, and that's the thing that's now holding up that debate. Senate bill, I think, much better for us. We are now, as a lot of you know who follow Washington, working through our FY25 budgetary process, and certainly, talking within our administration about what our agency's needs are. I will just say, and this is a topic I've raised with a couple of you on this call, and this is just me speaking, not official position. I mean, I think one question for the industry to grapple with is, even if the FAA can see some kind of resource growth, and we'll have to see how these budget years play out, it's not going to be at the pace, it might grow like this, and the pace is going to be like that, particularly I'd say in commercial space, advanced air mobility, some of the other, even regular commercial aviation is basically roared back to pre-pandemic levels and looks like it's going to continue to grow. We're an agency that has the ability to generate revenues, and I think that's going to be a question, for this industry and for other industries, which is there's a possibility of more revenue generation, because I think potentially getting all the dollars we need just with the sort of existing budgetary climate, that's going to be tough to do. So I don't know. I'll put that to this group. Maybe that's something I'd love folks' thoughts on. I don't know, George, if you have a thought on that.
Well, certainly if you look at the number of operations, it's order of magnitude greater than it was 5 years ago, and the increases in budget have been pretty flat. And so I think there's a strong case to be made, even with efficiencies, that might need to take another look at that. And again, if the going in position is, well, let's keep everybody flat or keep everybody at a small increase to fit within the pie, maybe periodically it's appropriate for different modes of operation, different lines of business to, I won't say a zero-based budget, but at least a metric check on benchmark of where are we putting the significant resources within the agency and within the department.
Thank you, George. Thank you so much, Deputy Secretary. I will turn it over to General Mercer for his question.
Thank you, Karina Dries. Deputy Secretary, thank you so much for your time and your comments and your thoughts. Getting back to this notion on the discussion about safety, I don't think anybody argues with the importance of safety and protecting the public and FAA and the Department of Transportation role in that. I think, in my view, the dialogue needs to be more around how we make those safety calculations, those safety determinations, those safety decisions. The safety community tends to want to stay the way they've done it over the last 50 years. It's operated great for us. That's the way we want to do it. Technology has leaped in the last 50 years. Rocket technology, rocket design has changed over the last 50 years. What can be determined as a mission success or failure has changed over the last 50 years. One of our commercial companies just had a second stage failure. Now, it's clearly that was a mission failure. That particular satellite on that particular rocket did not get it to its desired orbit and inclination. However, that was not a safety issue. It had nothing to do with public safety. It endangered nobody. But yet the safety community wants to call that as a failure that they put in their calculations. So my point of all that is that it's not about the fact that we have to ensure public safety and the FAA's role in that and the Department of Transportation role in that. I think everybody here would agree with that. Where I believe the dialogue needs to circle back to is how we do that and how we determine those calculations and what goes into that analysis to determine whether a particular operation or launch is going to be safe or not. So thank you very much.
Yeah, so General Mercer, let me give a quick response, and I certainly want Michael to jump in on this one as well. Because look, I think you're getting to the heart of the question, which I know is kind of front and center in the debate about where we go for commercial space and its growth, how we ensure its safety while making sure we can be sort of as responsive and nimble, as innovative as you all want us to be. And yes, let us just state, not easy to do. Safety organizations tend to be conservative by their nature. And I would say, again, having seen it from the outside and now from the inside, this is one of the ways in which government and private sector are so different. Failure is very much tolerated, in some cases even celebrated in the private sector. In the public sector, failure is swiftly punished. I'll give a quasi-humorous example. Last night on the House floor, the House voted to reduce my secretary's salary to $1. They voted on that for me too. They didn't vote to do that to me, but that's sort of what you face as a public official. So I'll admit, I think it breeds a certain conservatism, but I do think, and again, I think you're hearing it from Michael and from me, we recognize that we need to find ways to ensure that we're, if we're not moving at the speed of industry, that we're moving faster where we can. And I think I presume you're talking about the explosion in Boca Chica. Is that
No.
Okay.
No, that's not the one I'm talking about.
Okay.
This was another company that had a second stage failure. It was a successful launch off the pad. It wasn't until the second stage was actually in orbit that it had an engine malfunction out in space. So that second stage failed to perform as it should have. So the satellite did not get to its prescribed orbit and inclination, but it had nothing to do with human or personnel safety. Nobody was in danger or threatened by that. That satellite, that second stage, is way out in orbit by that point in time, way out in space. So that's my point, is that
Okay.
the way that the safety community looks at that is a failure. And yes, it is a mission failure. Yes, it is, but it is not a public safety failure.
Okay, I see Michael's nodding. He better take that one.
Yes, he's talking about Rocket Lab, I believe. Absolutely. When we look at safety in the agency, whether it's commercial space or aviation, it's about likelihood and severity, right? And try to figure out what that risk is. And part of the solution, I think, to what General Mercer brought up was the agency and the industry need to come together on what the actual safety data is, and collaborate on that and build a process around that safety data with risk acceptance built in, kind of like what we do in safety management systems, right? Low, medium, and high, and then build the process around that. And AST is hard at work on our internal processes to do exactly that, right? To look at what the real risk is, and then make the determination what the severity is, the likelihood of it happening, and then working from that and trying to build consensus about what the severity is, what the likelihood is, and then work together. And I think that's why sharing data between the industry and the agency is so important, because as we learn more and we grow more, we could build standards that help us get to that level, I think, in the future, which is where we want to be, where we share information, share data. And then if we have expectations that are already met because the operator is following a set plan that we fully know they're going to execute, then we can apply our limited resources on other things that could be more a higher risk, so to speak.
Yeah, thank you so much for those responses. We hopefully have time for just 2 more questions. I'll turn it over to Ms. Kate Cronmiller.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Trottenberg, thank you for coming and speaking to us. It's very nice of you, and I'm sure you're busy with other things. So thanks for your time, and thank you, Mr. O'Donnell. When COMSTAC was first formed, the Office of Commercial Space was set up under Secretary Dole, and the office reported directly to the secretary. And I'm not complaining, but I'm just wondering, is the industry has grown immensely since 1983. Dale will correct me, maybe it was 82, I forget. But, you know, you do have a huge difference in how you manage aircraft and how you manage rockets. And I think when you talk about safety and regulations, you know, I understand that we're all on the same page on safety, but maybe we need some independent thought and maybe some experts in rocketry helping you all understand the difference between those two. And the other reason I'm bringing this up is, as someone who works with appropriators daily, it might help if the office had an independent voice on the Hill so that they could be speaking on behalf of what they need, as opposed to maybe what they're being told they can say. And I'm not criticizing, I'm just pointing it out, because I did once work at NOAA, and NOAA was not allowed to say things because Department of Commerce controls NOAA. And as a result of that, we used to have subpoenas asking us whether we really needed 2 polar satellites or 1. Obviously they needed 2, but you know, it's just a thought I put in there for you to consider. And things have evolved a lot since COMSTAC was first formed.
Let me react to both of we said. I'm going to take the second one first, because I will say nobody gets to be independent. I don't care where you're going to sit in an agency. You have to be part of an administration and a part of an administration's overall budget strategy. So if they came over here to OST, I don't think that part would be different. Now, that said, I think everyone on this call knows Congress has its ways, as you're pointing out, of you know, asking for technical assistance and other things. And obviously, it's part of what we look for with all our stakeholders and partners to help educate Congress on potentially what different parts of the agency might need. So I don't think that, I don't know that anyone will ever get to be set loose to say whatever they want on Capitol Hill. That's not been my experience either in administrations or on the Hill. But I think your first question is a deep one that we have grappled with. It's funny, it's come up a lot over the course of my career, and it always comes up in a big agency like DOT. Are you better to be reporting to the people higher up the food chain, which gives you maybe some independence and different perspectives, but there won't be much bandwidth, or to be sort of ensconced in another part of the agency where maybe you have a little less autonomy and so forth, but people who can dedicate more bandwidth to you? You know, I think it's a worthy question, and certainly I think right now I'm hoping that I don't know, Mike will tell me if I'm wrong, maybe AST's getting a little bit of both, because they are embedded in an agency that I think is full of people who love their work and have the bandwidth and the passion to help them. But there is a lot of interest from me and from the secretary, and we are very much part of, I think at our level, what is helpful, which is those budget conversations with OMB, with the Hill, with our interagency partners, with the Vice President's office, with DOD, with Department of Commerce that I've gone toe to toe on a few things on, and with NASA. So I'm hoping maybe they've got a bit of both, but, you know, happy to hear, you know, and explore if we can get that, balance better. It is a fair question. They are a bit of a unique entity within FAA and within DOT. And I think it's fair to keep examining, are they in the right place organizationally? And more importantly, are the right parts of the leadership of the agency writ large giving them the support that they need.
Thank you.
And I would just add to that, Polly's right. And by the way, we spent a lot of time with the deputy secretary and the secretary. So access to them has been really good. And I came from the aviation side over to the commercial space side, and I am thrilled and excited about the access that we have in the interaction with the secretary's office. They're very supportive, and it's excellent. On the FAA side,
I paid him to say that, but it's appreciated nonetheless.
from the dollar increase, right? But this whole idea of being the agency is also a big plus, because when we're talking about integrating into the airspace for launches, it's really good to have commercial space inside the agency, because when we're talking about a Starship Super Heavy launch shortly before Thanksgiving, and integrating that launch into the airspace system, you want this office in this agency working that directly to access to the National Airspace System. So there's a real huge benefit to being here and being proponents of commercial space inside this agency that controls the airspace. So there's a plus there too, but I agree with this deputy secretary. We should always look for ways to streamline and communicate better.
Thank you so much. I know we're at time, but if we can ask one final quick question, I'd love to call on Mike French for a final question.
Thanks, Karina, and Deputy Secretary Trottenberg, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your attention, continued attention on space when you were at the FAA level and back at Deputy Secretary level. I think first I just wanted to respond to your question on the incremental growth on the budgets. I think something to think about there is the overall AST budget is just not that large. All right, so a significant increase on percentage-wise basis, could probably be fairly small when you're talking about FAA or THUD, type levels. And so something to think about is perhaps maybe you could do an FY25 sort of block jump in funding, given the amount of activity that's changed. And in the end of the day, it'd probably be, can be swallowed in the overall appropriation, just because overall it wouldn't be that much of a number. So just a thought there in terms of your question about, how do we deal with sort of incremental change over time on the budget front. But I'll leave it with the question here. Now you've dipped your toe into the FAA. More direct job, and I know you spent quite a bit of time with many of us talking about space. Are there certain issues that, as we think about where the core action is, that when it comes to space sort of remain, or you'll be paying particularly attention to from the DepSec suite?
Yeah, and I will observe, I think everyone is ducking a little bit my question, which is, does the industry need to start frankly contributing some revenues to solve, I think, the funding challenges that AST has. I hear you, Mike, that it seems like a small amount of money, but anyone who's been involved in the appropriations process knows every penny gets fought over. So I guess I will, that is one thing I'll put on the table for you all, I think, to engage more seriously on. I mean, kind of a humorous moment, I won't name names, when we came out with, I think, something sensible. I'll actually be interested to hear what you all think, kind of our guidelines and how we were going to balance, in terms of Michael mentioning the airspace, balancing the needs for commercial space with our regular commercial aviation. And we came out with some guidelines. You all are familiar with them, particularly trying to deconflict launches from real crunch periods, holidays, et cetera. And some of the folks in the industry sort of said, well, now you're favoring commercial aviation over commercial space. And I wanted to chuckle a little bit because, I mean, admittedly, commercial aviation funds most of the agency. So I'll leave you with that. I'll leave you with that thought. I think it is something you all probably, maybe would want to engage in, because I am worried, even as you're talking about that, it seems like small dollars. Just to give you a thought on some of the other needs that the FAA has right now. You all have seen the press that's happened this summer on near misses. And there are a lot of investments in, surface detection equipment at major airports that we still need to invest in. You've seen what's happened with this pilot incident on Horizon Air. We need to make sure we're doing everything we can to support our pilot community and our controller community. We need to hire up. So, I will just say this, you can say each little piece doesn't cost that much, but when you kind of add it all together, the agency has big needs writ large. So just for me, one of the things, I am not an aerospace engineer, as I said, but one of the things I am a good student of is kind of the appropriations process and how to get resources. And that for me is certainly something I promised all my colleagues at the FAA I'm going to continue to work hard on. I do think that the agency, every part of the agency needs more resources to carry out the mission that the traveling public expects, that all our industry partners expect, and that, you know, is important for not only our national economy, but frankly, our kind of our global leadership position as well.
Thank you so much, Deputy Secretary Trottenberg and Michael O'Donnell. Thank you so much for joining us at this COMSTAC meeting today. We really appreciate all of your time and the extra time you spent with us. I think it's been really valuable, and this group, you know, is very eager to continue, you know, engaging in these dialogues and working on some of these challenges with AST. So thank you so much. Brian,
All right.
back to you.
Thank you all. Wow.
Thank you all.
Look forward to working with you in the future and hope you have a productive rest of your meeting.
All right. Next on our agenda, we have a special guest from our FAA's Office of Airports, Mr. Michael Price. Michael is a senior airport compliance specialist in the FAA Office of Airports. Michael will be making a brief presentation on a forthcoming update to the Office of Airports definition of aeronautical activity and related Federal Register notice that's on its way. So with that introduction, may we have the slides presented? Thank you. Over to you, Michael.
Right. Thanks, Brian. Good afternoon. Good morning to everyone. As Brian mentioned, my name is Michael Price. I'm a senior airport compliance specialist in the FAA's Office of Airports. Today, just going to give you a brief update on the update we are making to the aeronautical activity definition. And next slide, please. All right. So before we get started, I do want to provide just a little bit of context about what this is all about. First of all, when an airport sponsor receives federal funding for airport land or airport development, they're also agreeing to 39 federal grant assurances. And the way those grant assurances are enforced are through the FAA's airport compliance program. And that's what my office does. We enforce the airport compliance program and enforce compliance with the 39 federal grant assurances. What this update is not an rulemaking. This is not an NPRM. This is not a rulemaking of any kind. This is a policy statement and a policy update to our order, which is FAA Order 5196B. That's the airport compliance program or compliance manual. And that's the instructions that the FAA has for our personnel internally to enforce the airport compliance program. So this update to the definition is actually to our definitions contained within the FAA order, which is internal facing. Another thing I want to mention is that the update definition itself does not impact aircraft operations at all. This is not related to aircraft, and it's not related to the national airspace as far as it impacts. And so it only applies to airport operators and those that have received federal funding or federal land conveyances. And so with that being said, I'll get started with a little bit more information. Next, please. All right, so the aeronautical activity definition has a pretty grand history. It goes all the way back to the Civil Aeronautics Act of 1938. Within the act, aeronautical activity was defined because the act also established a prohibition on exclusive rights. Exclusive rights means that no aeronautical activity can have exclusive right over a federally funded airport. In other words, there needs to be reasonable and not unjustly discriminatory access to all aeronautical users of the airport. No one can be given an exclusive right. And so because it was necessarily defined, it also defined non-aeronautical activities. And the way that's been approached over the years as far as updates go are Federal Register notices. There have been several Federal Register notices through the years, starting, I believe, in the 60s and beyond. So that's where we are today, making a new update to the definition itself. Next slide. Okay, so what's the purpose and the applicability? So the aeronautical activity definition itself is our baseline for determining whether a sponsor is providing reasonable access to a federally obligated airport. Federally obligated meaning having received federal funds or federal land conveyances. It applies to all aeronautical activities, pavements, that require access to airport ground facilities like pavements, hangars, land use, or aeronautical services. But more importantly, it applies to only within the geographical boundaries of the airport itself. And that's determined by the airport layout plan and specifically the Exhibit A property map that the airport sponsors are supposed to keep updated at all times. And so we're only talking about aeronautical access within the confines of the airport itself, not the airspace above the airport and not the land outside of the airport in most cases. So next slide. All right, so the relevant federal obligations, as I mentioned earlier, there are 39 federal obligations, and the whole purpose of the federal obligations are to ensure safe and reasonable access to the airport. And so within these federal obligations, there are several that mention aeronautical use, and I'm going to present those here. Grant Assurance 19, operations and maintenance, is there to ensure the airport is available for aeronautical users in a safe and serviceable condition. Grant Assurance 22, economic non-discrimination, ensures open access to aeronautical activities on terms that are reasonable and without unjust discrimination. And then Grant Assurance 29, the airport layout plan, the sponsor is to maintain an updated airport layout plan approved by the FAA depicting the safe and serviceable aviation and non-aviation facilities. So you can see that within the 39 federal grant assurances, and these specifically, the aeronautical activity definition really matters. And so that's what I wanted to illustrate here. Next slide. So this is an excerpt from the updated aeronautical activity definition that we have drafted. What you see in the red letters there are the improvements, the edits that we've made to the definition to include launch or reentry vehicles. We've also included UAS and advanced air mobility. This is not specific to commercial space on the whole. We are looking to update the definition to include all the new entrants that are presently before us as an agency, which is advanced air mobility, UAS, and commercial space. But what you're seeing there are the added. So for example, repair and maintenance of launch or reentry vehicles, sale of aircraft, launch or reentry vehicle parts, UAS and AAM, commercial space vehicle operations, and any other activities that because of their direct relationship to the operation of aircraft, UAS or space launch and reentry vehicles can be appropriately regarded as aeronautical activities. So one thing I want to point out is that this is not just about gaining access to a federally obligated airport. What this does is provides a level playing field for these new entrants, commercial space operators, UAS and AAM, to compete, not necessarily one-on-one, but to have access to a federally funded airport. So it just makes the level field, the playing field level for these users, and provides the ability for them to provide access, civil aviation access to the public on reasonable terms. Next slide, please. There is one built-in limitation to the definition. Activities that are not associated with the final assembly of an aircraft or a commercial space vehicle are not considered aeronautical activities. So standalone items such as aircraft and parts manufacturing and storage, aerospace R&D, flight simulation, training and management facilities, or engine testing facilities, many of those can be conducted off the airport and have no relation to an aircraft, at least as in terms of at the airport. So what we're saying here is that for it to be considered an aeronautical activity, it must be associated with the final assembly of the aircraft or the commercial space vehicle. But one thing I want to mention is that this does not mean that R&D, manufacturing, and storage cannot be located on the airport. It just means that they're not considered aeronautical and that the airport operator has more discretion in terms of reasonability and access and rates and charges, which I'll talk a little bit more in just a moment. Next slide. All right, so the benefits of being aeronautical is that, as I mentioned, that the access is protected under the federal obligations. Grant Assurance 22 requires that commercial space operators be provided access that are on terms that are reasonable and not unjustly discriminatory. Also, like I mentioned, no exclusive rights can be given either to other aeronautical operators or users or to the commercial space user. It goes two ways. This is a level playing field. Also, lease rates and cost of access, that's actually enshrined in Grant Assurance 24, fee and rental structure. But for aeronautical users, lease rates and cost of access can be lower than fair market value. They're not necessarily obtained by an appraisal. They are case-by-case basis at the airport based on the capital and operating cost of the airport itself. So the rates and charges the FAA does not involve itself with. We just require that they must be fair, reasonable, and the methodology used to generate those rates are transparent. But we don't get involved unless there are major complaints or concerns about the rates and charges themselves. And speaking of complaints, if you're an aeronautical user, you can file a complaint with the FAA. And so Part 13 complaints are informal. They're handled at the regional level or the district office level. Part 16 complaints, that's what our office, we adjudicate those. Those are formal complaints. And so if you're an aeronautical user, you can complain about maybe an access restriction or a rates and charge or some other safety consideration, something at the airport that the user believes there is a problem in terms of access. They can be adjudicated via an informal complaint or a Part 16 formal complaint. Next slide. So disadvantages. So if we were not to consider commercial space, UAS, or AAM as aeronautical, if we considered them to be non-aeronautical, that access to the airport is not protected under the federal obligation. An airport sponsor has no obligation to provide access to a non-aeronautical activity. Non-aeronautical generally being that they can be conducted anywhere else, not necessarily have to be located at the airport. If the sponsor chooses to provide access, it can set whatever terms, conditions, or requirements it wants, including restrictions. And the FAA does not involve itself with non-aeronautical activities on airports in terms of forcing the sponsor to reasonably accommodate. And if the land is federally funded, the non-aeronautical use requires FAA approval in most cases. When it comes to lease rates and cost of access, a non-aeronautical use by FAA policy and regulation or statute must be collected at fair market value. That's usually higher. It's usually generated by an appraisal, and those rates and charges are not subject to review. We do not involve ourselves with rates and charges for non-aeronautical uses of airport property. And also, if you're a non-aeronautical user, you do not have the ability to complain to the FAA under Part 13 or Part 16, formally or informally. And next slide. So where we are today is that we have drafted a Federal Register notice. It's a policy statement to add commercial space, UAS, and AM, as I just mentioned, for the purpose of aeronautical access to a federally obligated airport. As I mentioned, it does not interfere with the airspace or aircraft operation or international agreements. And once this is published, we will be seeking comments. And so there will be a 30-day comment period. And publishing is imminent. The FRN has been drafted. It's in process now, actually, to be published. So we welcome and encourage any comments that you may have to this policy update, and look forward to adjudicating the comments. And I believe that's it, Brian.
Thank you, Michael. I guess we have time for short Q&A. If any COMSTAC members has any questions for Michael and aeronautical activity, we can take those now.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Michael, for that presentation. We've been hearing for a while about this change coming up, so it's really helpful to just understand what's motivating this change and how it really impacts the industry. So I really appreciate it. You're definitely speaking my language. Before this role, I was actually running Mojave Air and Spaceport. So a lot of, experience with airport layout plans and AIP and all the acronyms that you just introduced to this group. I'm curious, one of the things that you mentioned is this really only applies to the ALP. So any activity that's taking place within the ALP should qualify under aeronautical use. Does that mean that airports, and I forgive this ignorant question, I actually don't know, have the discretion to choose what's included in the ALP on their property and what's not. Because I guess I was under the impression that airports essentially had to include all their property within the ALP, even though some of it was just designated for federal funding and some of it was not.
All airport property must be shown on the ALP, and more specifically, the Exhibit A property map. That's what we look at to see what is considered to be federally obligated airport property. In some cases, there are parcels of land that are adjacent to the airport or outside of the airport for various reasons, but all airport property, all the property owned by the airport sponsor must be included in the Exhibit A property map in the ALP. So there's no variation on that. It must be listed on the ALP.
All right, that's helpful. Thanks. Dale, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. Just looking for some clarifications and to educate myself. We are working with the Congress to try to get changed legislation that would allow spaceport bonds to be tax exempt, analogous to how they are at airports and for docks and wharves at seaports. And just again, for my own edification, I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on the rationale that would indicate that manufacturing on airports doesn't fall under aeronautical, because I'm trying to see how that might bleed into conversations with we've been dealing with the Joint Taxation Committee, and they pointed out that airports used to allow manufacturing on airports to be covered under tax exempt bonds, but because of misbehavior or whatever, they no longer do. But if our comeback to that was, well, you can manufacture an airport somewhere else and fly it to the airport you're considering. You can't manufacture some of the larger rockets and fly it then to your launch pad or spaceport. So I don't expect us to absolve that question today. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit so I educate myself for future conversations. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Our basic position is that if it can be conducted off the airport and is not associated with the final assembly of an aircraft there on the airport, then that's just considered, that will be considered non-aeronautical. That it's not necessarily a perspective that you can't be on the airport. It's just that it's not considered aeronautical for the purposes of a federally obligated airport. The airport sponsor can still allow that parts manufacturing, with the appropriate reviews and approvals and site location and everything that goes along with siting on an airport. But the actual activity of manufacturing is not prohibited on the airport property. It's just not considered an aeronautical activity for the purposes of federally obligated airport access, and then the related protections and restrictions that come along with being an obligated airport. So just want to make clear that we're not saying that it can't be there. It's just that it falls under a slightly different perspective on as far as the definition goes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dale. Amanda?
Yes, hi, good afternoon, and thank you for sharing this with the COMSTAC. Appreciate it. Two quick questions, and again, pardon my ignorance, but you kept talking about airports. Is this going to also apply to spaceports? Do we need to add that into the definition? That's part A. And then part B of my question is, you talk about final assembly. Is there a definition of final assembly? Because in the space world, you may have a payload capsule and a launch vehicle that don't get finally assembled until right before launch, but is everything else considered not assembly, or final assembly? So I'm kind of curious as to that definition.
Well, final assembly, that's not a new concept. What's happening here is it's being applied to commercial space as a new entrant. And first, let me just say, we would certainly welcome comments in that regard in terms of FRN. If there are concerns about the definition of final assembly and how maybe it does not specifically or may not perfectly fit within our definition as currently described. But we don't have final assembly as a definition, but the way we've always interpreted it in the traditional aviation sense was parts come in one side and a full aircraft comes out the other side. That's the final assembly in our perspective, and that's how we've applied it to airports through the years. But again, we're certainly open to comments, and we would welcome the comment if that particular perspective on final assembly does not seem to fit, or you have ideas about how we can make it fit. We're certainly open to that, but we've interpreted it in more in the traditional civil aviation sense, that parts in and a full aircraft out on the other side. Otherwise, the activity itself could be conducted elsewhere. And what we're really trying to do here is preserve the use of airport property, right? It's a finite commodity, I guess. There's only so much available land at most airports. And so the idea here is to preserve the land and the land use for those that directly serve the civil aviation users in the NAS. And so if it does not have to be on the airport, we've had to draw at least a bit of a line there on what can and cannot be at the airport in terms of aeronautical versus non-aeronautical in the definition.
And with regards to spaceports?
Okay, spaceports. Yes, sorry. Thank you. So spaceports, as you well know, go through the Part 420 launch site licensing process. So yes, an airport that has already or is seeking to go through the launch site licensing process and receives the requisite credentials from AST for that operation, those are most certainly considered an aeronautical activity and aeronautical use. I mean, that's where commercial space and traditional civil aviation actually departs a little bit. We have other users that don't go through any kind of launch or site licensing type process. With commercial space, that helps to sort of solidify the access to the airport with that launch site license. So there is no contradiction of any kind when it comes to spaceports versus airports. Now, our position is specifically to airports. Non-airport spaceports do not fall anywhere under this definition at all. So I want to make that distinction.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. It definitely sounds like this is a step in the right direction, for FAA to go in this direction, because it is very challenging for airports and spaceports that are co-located. Where do you draw that line? Because, especially when you have these hybrid vehicles where you have an airplane, it's very clearly an airplane, but you've got some rocket element to it with AST involved. It is difficult as an airport sponsor to kind of distinguish between the two. You definitely made it clear in your presentation that this only really applies to federally funded facilities. Are there any implications whatsoever for commercial space operators that have their own facilities? Do you expect down the road for aeronautical use to have an impact when it comes to airspace requirements or anything along those lines?
Let's see and make sure I captured the question correctly. The airports. Well, could you repeat the first part of your question? There was a couple components there.
Yeah. So what I'm asking is, in your presentation, you made it clear that this change in definition really only applies to airports that receive federal funding. Do you see any implications whatsoever to commercial space infrastructure outside of that? Sites that have their own infrastructure, or do you see this as a step in that direction to start including some additional sites down the road in that definition?
So I haven't seen anything to suggest that we're looking to move beyond the airports that are included in the National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems. So when we talk about the aeronautical access, we're talking about the 3,100 airports that are in the National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems. And that's what this definition will apply to in terms of enforcement of the grant assurances. Certainly, if it's expanded to include facilities that are not in the NIPIAS, that's something that congressional interest will have to resolve. But we in the Office of Airports know of nothing that would suggest that we're looking to go outside of the NIPIAS, the Plan of Integrated Airports.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful, Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Karina. By the way, I'm so thrilled to hear about your experience as an airport manager. I, as a former airport manager and a director of safety in the Office of Airports, all this is near and dear to my heart. I agree with Karina. There is nothing but benefit for commercial space operators for this. And we in AST will make sure that it wouldn't mission creep into anything else without us talking and figuring out what the benefit is to space operations and our mission too. So you have our commitment to make sure that that happens. Having been on the airport management side, now on the space side, I feel like I got a good view of both. And I think this is really good for those that want to operate on an airport and have equal access to the system. That's really the benefit for the commercial space operators. And we had this conversation quite in depth back when Front Range came about, and Calvin and I were working on opposite ends of the table trying to make Front Range happen. And we did. So the key for us, though, is very close coordination with the Office of Airports as we move along and as we grow and as we do things. We're learning from each other. So you have our commitment to COMSTAC that we will stay closely aligned with airports and work with them as we move through this, as we find new ways to do business and operate better. So I agree, and thank you for your comments, Karina, on accepting what they're proposing. I think it's really good.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Michael. We really appreciate this. We would love, I know Mike French would agree with me, for our members to hear this presentation outside of COMSTAC. So if you're willing to do this a second time, at least with some of the trade associations, we can make sure that a lot of the more applicable groups are involved. It would be really appreciated if you're willing to do this again.
All right, will do.
Great, thank you so much. Brian, I think I'm turning it back over to you.
Well, thank you, Karina. We're going to move on. So we tasked COMSTAC to work on two tasks. The first task we'd like to discuss now. I'd like to introduce Mr. Jim Hatt, who you all know well, Space Policy Division Manager from our own Commercial Space Transportation Office. We'll be presenting lessons learned information system, a database that we've been contemplating for quite some time. If we could get the slide deck put back up and the LLIS slides. Thank you, Mr. Hatt.
All right, thank you very much, and glad to be back here. So the task on the lessons learned information system. This is one that we've talked about here in COMSTAC for a couple sessions now, and I want to go over it since you've had the task. The purpose of this is for the government and industry to provide lessons learned during any aspect of licensing, mishap investigations, or other regulatory-based activity. They'll be general in nature and not attributable to any company. NTSB has also recommended that we do this. And so we're asking, given the information here, for your initial recommendations and advice on implementing this database system. So next slide, please. All right, so you've seen this. Initially, the database would be populated with items from AST. One of the things I would want to put forward right up front, what this is not. This is not voluntary safety reporting system. This is pure lessons learned. Hey, we figured out after a couple things, this is a better way of doing it. You might even want to think of it as a living best practices information system. Hey, here's a lesson that we learned on doing this. So it is not, hey, this rocket engine didn't work because we failed to do this, or that's not necessarily what this is. And most of this data would be initially from AST, what we've learned from licensing, maybe doing analysis, safety inspections, mishap investigations, etc. However, industry be invited to voluntarily submit their own lessons learned in a manner that protects proprietary information. We've already started and have a form. We have not submitted it through the Office of Management and Budget to get them to approve it. but we have this started. So next slide, please. Like I said, over the years, we've kind of talked about this. One of the drawbacks is due to the limited number of operators and the number of vehicles being fairly small and the vehicles being unique. It's been a little challenging to say, hey, if we put any information out there, it may be attributable to a certain vehicle or to a certain company. The other side, now we have increased launch and reentry rates. That provides more data points. This LLIS would also provide a means to identify lessons learned to facilitate operators who are submitting applications under the new Part 450, not only just under the licensing piece, but maybe some analysis, maybe mishap investigation. Maybe there are some things out there, hey, in general, this would be something good to do or to avoid doing. So that's where we're looking at. Next slide, please. Just a couple other data points. In 2015, NTSB issued a safety recommendation to continue to work to implement a database of lessons learned. And then again, in July 2023, we responded, we are looking at this and we will be working with the industry to come up with a way to implement this. So those are a couple of the data points there. Next slide. So kind of the timeline that we've been under. The lessons learned information system was started quite a few years ago, as I mentioned. In 2015, kind of got started and then put on hold. In 2018, COMSTAC members at the time expressed some concerns about putting this out due to possible identification of operators or vehicles. This past summer, we've kind of reinvigorated this and started looking at it again. We've given this now to you for COMSTAC for your review, advice, and recommendations on implementing it. And potentially in summer of 2024, taking your inputs, we will potentially implement this lessons learned information system. Unless there are any questions, I believe that's the last slide.
Yeah, and we've got a couple slides here on sort of some of COMSTAC's initial thoughts on this. So I guess to be fair, we didn't have a whole lot of time to really digest and respond appropriately. We've had a couple of initial working group calls with members to just get some initial thoughts, and that's what we've jotted down here, some of these initial thoughts. But what we owe back to AST is a more thorough white paper of sorts to put these recommendations back out to you. Or I don't know if we want to say recommendations, but probably observations, other suggestions to consider, that something along those lines. But what I wanted to do is at least have a couple of these thoughts up here to get a conversation going with members. So, we do understand that the FAA is moving forward with the lessons learned database. The question is, how likely will operators be in participating in some of these activities? How valuable might that information be or not be? I guess, those are some of the questions we would want to ask. But I also want to just disclose that there are very few launch operators at the moment on the COMSTAC. There are many other operators that are not on the COMSTAC and or spaceports as well. So, organizations that could have an opinion on this down the road. I think it'd be valuable to get some of their input in the future. But what I wanted to just sort of highlight here are some of the themes that I was hearing in these working group calls that we held. FAA had presented that these requests are essentially coming from other organizations in large part. And some of these organizations have a lot of experience, obviously, with transportation related industries, but not so much on commercial space. And where, in aviation, you have very similar types of vehicles or very similar designs and concepts in the commercial space industry, everything is different. Every single vehicle is unique. And so I know that it was mentioned several years ago in one of the COMSTAC meetings, but it absolutely still applies today. So the question is, how valuable is that really going forward if every single design is different from the next company? So that was kind of the main theme, I think, that was really coming from this is whether it's going to provide that robust value to FAA in the end. Similarly, whether operators are going to participate in something like this, I think really boils down to what value do they get from that, or what risks, more importantly, do they see as if they weigh in on some of these not investigations, but within the database itself. If the request is for the operators to put in additional information, how likely is it that some of that information will be disseminated and the public will then know more specifics about that particular incident? So those were sort of the overarching concerns and observations that we had documented. I'd like to just pause and see if folks on the COMSTAC want to elaborate on any of those things, maybe discuss things that I did not include here on this slide.
Brina, this is Megan Mitchell. I don't have much to add, but I'll just speak up and say what you captured in terms of concerns is, what Blue Origin has been thoughtful and kind of worried about. I mean, essentially, if we look at the New Shepard vehicle, we are the only suborbital capsule system currently flying, right? So in an information system where it talks about a suborbital mishap of some sort related to a capsule, well, gee, who could that have been, right? So I appreciate the value in what we want to do in sharing and having lessons learned. But again, this gets back to and really harkens to the discussion we continue having as operators right now. Although the industry has grown significantly, there are not a ton of operators. And I know that, some of my counterparts, whether we're talking about Virgin or obviously SpaceX with a significant launch cadence, we are growing incredibly as an industry. We are seeing increase in operations, but in terms of different vehicles and architectures at the moment, it's just not that significant. So something like this is difficult to really figure out how the information would be made less particular to designs and then still be beneficial.
Thank you, Megan. Yeah, that theme definitely came out clearly during the working group calls.
Karina, this is Mike. I'll just sort of share, similar to Megan, it's aligned with your points here, but some feedback, that I received from various launch providers, underscoring the point that you made and Megan made, that continued concern about identification. One idea that we heard that could be, positive feedback as we turn this into more formal recommendations was, perhaps there's more room in licensing and compliance lessons learned versus mishap lessons learned. And so if perhaps we focus a little more on that licensing and compliance type things, that could be very useful for the FAA team. And, for training and new inspectors, inspector development, that sort of thing. And perhaps by shying away from some of the mishap work, we don't as much get into this identifiable proprietary issue that we've highlighted. So that was one bit of feedback I thought was interesting. Another one, and this is probably more to explore, depending on where this goes, but is that questions of incentives to participate? There's a lot of different reporting systems like this that are tied, the reporting system's tied to various incentives for participation. I think that would have to be weighed, obviously, with this same concern about the danger of any proprietary information becoming released. But I did get some, questions there, and perhaps more, more interest in how other operators would participate if we thought a bit about how it could fit in overall on an incentive basis. Thanks, Karina.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we've got some of those listed on the next slide. If we want to flip to the next slide. So that definitely came through, when we had these conversations, is the real pain point for operators is the licensing challenges, first and foremost. And I think a lot of folks within AST would agree as well. There's still so much that needs to be worked through on 450. So I think, the themes that we really got from this group with these working group calls was, mishaps are far and few between, but everyone is sort of feeling some of these challenges with licensing. And so to Mike's point that he just discussed here is, if we can maybe create an environment where operators can get together and share some of their lessons learned on licensing challenges alongside AST, maybe as a CDM or something along those lines, I think, as a potential next step or a future step in down the road, when you have a more sort of robust industry, then you have an opportunity to get that same group together to talk about lessons learned with mishaps or something along those lines. But at the pain point today really is on licensing. So that seemed to be sort of the core suggestion that we received back from some of the operators that participated in this conversation, is let's focus instead on those topics. And, if that same group is willing to participate then down the road, once the industry becomes a little bit more established, then it might make more sense then. I think, one of the members that we had on the working group call sort of mentioned, the industry today is sort of like aviation in the 1930s, where we just don't have that kind of cadence. We don't have that variety of vehicles where this information is necessarily going to be valuable. So that was kind of the essential take from folks in the industry. But again, we understand the FAA is going to move forward with their version of the database. The question is, how to incentivize the operators to participate. Any feedback on some of these suggestions here that we provided?
Hey, Karina or Jim, I'm sorry, this is a dumb question, but is this a voluntary database?
Absolutely, yes. And to Karina's point, the envisioning is really starting with licensing, which I think is the pain point, and then growing out, and absolutely it would be voluntary. Totally 100% voluntary, yes.
And is the FAA open to a process that sort of lays the foundation for a public-facing database down the road, but the initial step is one that is more closely held even among the operators at AST? So there's an information exchange that's happening, but it's not in a public-facing database?
Would certainly, take that. Absolutely, yes.
Maybe Matt, that's
ahead,
the work that we're doing with FAR Part 193, which protects voluntary submitted data so that it can't be accessed, and that's how it worked on the aviation side. The problem is we're under Title 51 and Title 49, and so we're trying to get the read from General Counsel on that specific application of Part 193 to protect voluntary submitted data. But even still, in reauthorization, we've seen language would add that under Title 51, which would be really beneficial to your point. So we're working that as well.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, Jim, can I just follow up on Matt's question there? Did I hear though in your will this begin though with information that FAA itself populates?
Yes. Yes.
And so for that piece, I mean, is there a check, before that goes live that piece is not including information that could be proprietary or not for public release?
Yeah, that makes it a bit confusing. If I can just tag on to what Mike just said. Yeah, Jim, are you guys going to be, if you're going to populate this, are you going to come back to the launch providers that you're genericizing the information from to verify that it is generic enough or not, releasing something proprietary?
Yeah, and to be real honest, the lessons are not necessarily the lessons learned, not lessons. Sorry, harkening back to my education days. The lesson is the information is, again, on licensing. We have found that if you do this, it makes things easier. If you include all, and I'll pulled some stuff out. If you include all the information in one package, so very generic stuff. But if we do get into something that is a little more specific, absolutely, we will come back to the person that's tied with or the company that's tied to. Oh, absolutely, yes.
All right. Anything else we want to discuss with this? Any other opinions or comments?
Hey, Karina, I think that the CDM is a great idea. I love seeing that. That's fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought that was a really good suggestion that came out of this group, for sure. So, what we can do is work on something a little bit more formal. I wanted to get a discussion here just to make sure that we were sort of on the right track with this response. And so what I'll do is take the first stab at drafting a response and then get the COMSTAC members over the next couple of months to weigh in on the white paper that we submit, and we'll get something a little bit more formal back to FAA. Does that sound all right with everyone?
Sounds good to me. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jim.
Certainly. Thank you.
I think we want to take a little break, right? Do we want to reconvene at 1:45 or do we want to come back a little bit earlier? Brian, do you have a preference?
1:45 is good. Stick to the agenda and we're
Okay.
rocking and rolling.
Sounds great. So we'll take a break until 1:45. Thanks, everyone. All right, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully we can go ahead and get started. Do I need to wait for any logistics on FA's end?
No, I think we're good to go.
Excellent, excellent. I see Randy's here. So Randy, welcome. Randy Repchek has a long and distinguished career within the FAA, currently serves as a Deputy Director of the Office of Strategic Management at AST. Randy has been instrumental in shaping the policies and licensing practices at FAA AST. Randy is here to provide updates on COMSTAC recommendations and future plans. Welcome, Randy.
Thank you. And can someone put the slides up? Or is that my job, Brian? Okay. Okay, next slide. Okay, thanks. So bear with me. I have 9 slides that look like this. All right, so I'm going to go through all the different recommendations in our response, and then I have like 4 slides after that to talk about some rulemaking and some ACs. So the first recommendation here is that the FAA should prioritize updating the 2014 recommended practices for human spaceflight occupant safety document and seek additional resources if additional work is proposed for human spaceflight occupant safety. So first of all, we did update the recommended practices document. We put that out on September 30th, 2023. So we got that done. We've been using that in the human spaceflight Spark as a way to start talking about some of the safety issues for human spaceflight. But the second part of this recommendation is to seek additional resources. We did get additional resources in FY23 to hire 10 additional people, and we had some contract money that came with that as well. We haven't hired all the people just yet. We're about a little over halfway through, and we're trying to get those people on board. But the idea is that we'll use those folks for any kind of human spaceflight work, but it should not otherwise impact the licensing we have going on. Okay, the second one here is, in a limited resource environment, the FAA should ensure that activities in this area should not negatively impact the FAA's ability to manage the current and expected increase in launch and reentry license activity and other current statutory duties of the office. And like I said, we got the 10 people for human spaceflight. And one thing I'll say is that, just for example, as the recommended practice document that we put out, we really struggled to get that updated because all the folks that were working on that were working licensing. And so we've always prioritized the licensing over this kind of work as best we can. And so, yeah, we struggled with that, but it was really hard to get that out with the resources we did actually have. Okay, next slide. So these next 3 slides are on STEM. And what I wanted to do is have our division manager who works in the STEM area, Brian Rushforth, just give a brief overview of what we actually do in STEM, and then we'll go through these different recommendations. So hopefully Brian is on.
I am.
Great. Thanks, Brian.
Okay, so again, I'm Brian Rushforth. So I'll be going through just from a large 30,000 foot item. The very first STEM thing we're talking about is actually one of the major projects we just completed last year. We worked very closely with not just the FAA and its STEM program, but also we've been participating with the White House on the Industry Skilled Workforce Coalition to for the See Yourself in Space, and we've had a lot of work with that. We work extensively with various schools and also the Model Rocketry Challenge. When we have regional events that come up, we are able to at times send people who are on their own time. Typically, it might be an air show or something like that on a weekend. And then we're also working for the upcoming year, working very closely with again with our FAA STEM group that we fall under, we coordinate with is sponsoring schools, and one of our goals for this upcoming fiscal year is to host our own space event at the FAA. So that's still in the planning stages. I would say that part of the for my division, where we focus on these things in research and development and tool development and training and all that, we have to balance the resources we have along with the ability for folks to not pull them away from the licensing side. So that of the 30,000 foot is sort of where we go on STEM, and with that, Randy will take you through the other recommendations.
Great, thank you, Brian. So this first recommendation is to ensure harmonization between the Department of Transportation, STEM workforce efforts, and the White House-led Space Industry Skilled Workforce Coalition. As Brian said, we work mostly with the FAA STEM AVSED office, and we kind of work with the FAA group, which also works with DOT and the White House and all that. So we're tapped into all those things, but we're not really. I think it's safe to say we're not the leader of that. We try to contribute where we can. And same thing with the second one: create a space workforce messaging portal and newsletter to notify STEM workforce partners of opportunities. And we do not have a message portal. I believe the FAA does, though, in the AVSED. So like I said, we work with the FAA. Okay, next slide. So this other recommendation here is to establish a mechanism for industry inputs into the DOT-related tasks of the interagency roadmap to support space-related STEM education and workforce. Establish workforce development officers to build STEM workforce pipelines, including regional post-secondary STEM internship programs. So once again, we've actually seen no actions from that that roadmap to DOT specifically. Do you have anything else to add on that one, Brian?
Not since 2022. There was the
Okay.
initial government-wide See Yourself in Space and some various major internship programs with NASA and Department of Defense, and there's the White House put a whole series of the initiatives out there in early September of 2022, but there hasn't really been a major effort in the same scale since then. The current things that they're going to be that we've seen, not necessarily from this group, but from others, are items like HBCUs and involving them. The White House did a conference with them last month, I believe, and then in the spring is National STEM Challenge with the Department of Education, and that is something we are in fact involved in. And that's another government-wide item. But in terms of follow-ons of this specific task force, most of the big stuff was accomplished in 2022. We haven't had any new taskings.
Thanks, Brian. Next slide. Okay, the last on STEM is highlight space industry jobs available and identify academic and extracurricular points of engagement within FAAST. Now here, we're quite active, particularly we had a big hiring effort last fiscal year. And of course, we were very much part of in the college level, going to career fairs and just trying to make relationships with different colleges and universities for our recruitment. Once again, our folks do go out to middle and high schools. And Brian did mention one of the most successful one, I think, is that the America Rocketry Challenge, which is a high school model rocket competition that's held every year right here in Virginia. And we participate in that. In fact, some of us have mentored some of the high school teams in the past. And this last one, extend the Department of Labor's space-focused apprenticeship accelerator model. And we have not done this. We don't have the resources to do this particular recommendation. Okay. All right, thanks. Thanks, Brian. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the FAA should conduct a voluntary, non-attributable survey to assess the implementation of developed voluntary consensus standards. And I think what the actual recommendation is once additional standards are developed, do this survey. So we agree with that. At some point in the near future, after additional standards are developed, we will try to find a way to understand this. My understanding at this point is that there's not a whole lot of use of the voluntary consensus standards at this time. That might change as they get developed, but at this point, we don't see a whole lot of use, but we will try to do a survey at some point. Second one here is the FAA should continue to encourage current efforts to develop industry consensus standards and increase participation in the ASTM F47 committee to guide, develop, and assess standards development efforts. The FAA should also continue to provide technical feedback on the standards that have been developed or are currently under development and participate in the balloting. So I think we're doing a lot of work on this, of course. We've been working with ASTM F47 since its inception. We've always had a member on the executive committee. We've had members of our staff involved with standard development and all the way through. One thing we have changed recently, so that these standards, particularly the ones that are meant to be means of compliance for our regulations, we are going to provide feedback at the early stage of the standard drafting. So when a working group is coming up with some kind of idea for a standard, we'll respond. We'll review the scope of that standard to see if that will actually, if it's meant to be a means of compliance, will eventually at the end support a licensing as a means of compliance. So that's the one change we have made so that we have more success with this. Okay, next slide. Okay, the FAA should assess the completeness of standards to serve as a means of compliance and provide guidance on how it will review and accept standards as a means of compliance. So there's two aspects to accepting a voluntary consensus standard as a means of compliance. First of all, if the process works the way it should, and it does, these are like a body like ASTM that knows how to put together the committees to write the standards. To some extent, we can trust the process, right? So what comes out the other end of that process should be a standard that would meet our requirements. Because we're involved, the industry is involved, and so ideally, when it comes out of a committee like that, it should be acceptable. So, but we do have a process in house. We have something called a technical review board that we will go through standards that are meant to be means of compliance, and officially accept them as means of compliance, and then we would add that to our means of compliance table. But like I said, one thing I mentioned earlier, we're trying to change that we get involved early in the standard development process so that at the end of the day, it will meet our requirements. Okay, the next one is in addition to industry standards, means of compliance for future performance-based requirements should include government standards and other unique means of compliance developed by an individual applicant. So first of all, on government standards, we already have a number of government standards that are acceptable means of compliance, like RCC 319, RCC 324. I think there's a NASA standard, I forgot the number, on lightning protection. But yes, any government standard that's out there already that we can improve as a means of compliance, we should. Unique means of compliance are a little bit different. Usually what we mean by unique means of compliance is as applicants apply for a license, they may not use an AC or a government standard. They have their own way of meeting that performance-based requirement. And we call that a unique means of compliance. Those we don't publish because they're all proprietary. They're all in an application process. But our vision anyway, and that's why the response is a bit misleading. Our vision is, as we get experience with Part 450 and as we see different applications come through in the ways different applicants comply with certain requirements, we can gather up lessons learned and eventually update our advisory circulars with those new ideas. We would never use proprietary information, and we would never, but as we learn ourselves how to do these things better, we'll update our ACs. Okay, next slide. Okay, FAA AST provide update on efforts to streamline licensing, range safety approvals, and other processes. Okay, so we're doing a lot of different things here. And the first one, probably is the most significant, is updating Part 450. We do have a team together that's now looking at the kind of changes that we think should be made to Part 450. And we just got that team together. We're going to put a list together of like the 15 big ones, or whatever the number is. And we do plan to actually give those to COMSTAC and task COMSTAC to look at our list of what we think is important in Part 450 to modify and get feedback on. We were trying to get that list to you before Thanksgiving. It will probably be closer to Christmas. And then the idea to be at the next COMSTAC meeting, get some recommendations. I see a hand up, Ted.
Yeah, you talk about working with the ranges. Which specific ranges are you talking about? Just the federal ranges?
I don't think I mentioned ranges, but we always work with the federal launch ranges. But because there's some unique issues there using government services. But we'll work with obviously all the spaceports and all the different companies. But right now we're trying to, like I said, get our thoughts together just with our experience using Part 450. And like I said, put our list together, what we think could be changed, and then you give that to COMSTAC. So that's kind of our plan.
Okay. I was just looking at your response there.
Okay.
Just says,
I see.
Working.
Oh yeah, that's another. I'm sorry. That's another part of my answer here. I'll get to that. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. So besides the rulemaking, not everything in Part 4, not all the problems in Part 450 have to be changed by regulation, right? So we have to also improve our processes. And one is, like Ted mentioned here, is working with the ranges. We have a policy about to come out pretty soon on how we accept the services of a federal launch range. Because we're trying to clarify that for both internally AST and for the industry. So that'll be coming up pretty soon. We actually think we work pretty well with the ranges, but this will at least get down on paper how we think that should work. And we're also just trying to improve other processes as well. One example is often with a license application, there's some gray areas, some issues come up, safety issues come up. There's not a clear answer. And sometimes in the licensing teams, we kind of, as my boss likes to say, we admire the problem, right? We talk about it, we go back and forth lots of times. What we're trying to do is when we find these say gray areas or areas that are not clear answers, elevate them right away, right? Get them into some kind of process so we can review them and make a decision, right? So because it's good for two reasons. One is it gets the decision done fast. And also we have a very set process to make these sometimes hard calls, right? Sometimes there's some hard safety calls to make. We want to have a better process in-house to get those made relatively quickly. So we're doing things like that. And also most of you have probably heard we have an application portal we're putting together. It's called LEAP. It's meant to modernize the application process, and we should have our first version of that out by the end of the fiscal year. We're working with a contractor now, and so that should also hopefully make things go a little bit better. So we're always looking for ways to improve our processes and our guidance for Part 450, in addition to actively working to make corrections to Part 450 to make it better. Okay, the next recommendation here is to brief the results from the National Spaceport Interagency Working Group and solicit state and private spaceports participation and feedback. So we do have a number of recommendations that came out of that group. I think we briefed those to we briefed a draft to the industry back in June. We are now finalizing those, and we're working with the National Space Council to get those finalized. And we should have those out in a few weeks. So we're looking forward to sharing this with the folks. And the next recommendation here is FAA-AST brief the National Space Council on launch infrastructure and facility construction delays and commodity shortages and proposed initiatives to address space-related infrastructure shortfalls. We will do that as delays and shortages are identified, but also a lot of those recommendations that come out of that working group are about these things, right? They're about infrastructure and things like that, and commodity shortages. So you'll see that in the recommendations. Okay, next slide. Okay, so ensure that advisory circulars are accurate and accommodate variations in vehicle complexity and prevent regulatory burdens with no public safety benefit. So we try to we put our ACs through a pretty rigorous process, and we try to make them pretty accurate when they come out. But we also realize that these ACs are living documents, and we do the best we can on the first go around. And we realize we have to continuously update them as we learn more and use them more. In fact, I'll show you a list a little bit later of the ACs, and you'll see a few of them are already being revised. But what's also really important for these ACs is that there is a comment form in the back. And so as anybody in the industry sees an issue with the AC, please respond and give us some feedback on it, because like I said, these are living documents, and we do want to make them not just accurate, but just useful. And so one thing we do struggle between trying to get the new ACs out and revising the old ones, because there's only a set bandwidth we have to put these to work on ACs, but we do the best I can there. Please, we need feedback on specific ACs and what's specifically wrong with them. The next one here is AC should make distinctions between launch and reentry when differences exist. AC should distinguish between launch versus reentry license requirements, or at least include distinct sections discussing the difference in applicability of many of the regulations. Yeah, so this is really about launch and reentry. We combined launch and reentry into Part 450, and I think there's some growing pains there. But we hear this loud and clear. In the ACs we publish in the future, and those that we revise, we are going to try to more clearly distinguish between launch and reentry where that makes sense to do. And I also think when we update Part 450, we'll probably try to do a better job between launch and reentry to try to distinguish those things. So we heard this loud and clear. Okay, next slide. This is the last one of the recommendations. The FAA should provide more transparency into the software and analysis tools that have been accepted for use. So this is a really big issue, and we probably have some more conversations to have around this. I do know I know one area this has come out is in the Part 440 Spark, talking about financial responsibility. There's been I believe a lot of discussion about the tool we use and the process we use to come up with NPL value for insurance purposes. But I also think this is a broader comment about the risk analysis tools that we have in-house and that are acceptable to the industry. And so happy to have a bigger conversation about that. We have certain tools that we use that were developed by the government over many, many years. And so we're very confident in our tools. And we do know there's it can be a challenge for for individual applicants to get the tool they need to meet our requirements. And so this is still a pretty significant issue, and we should probably talk about it further. And the last one is the FAA should clarify as needed and as needed amend Part 450 to address challenges with requirements that are distinct to launch and reentry. And same comment about launch and reentry. And also should prioritize Part 450 clarification through guidance and policy balanced with reform. So like I mentioned earlier, we are trying to do a number of things with ACs and procedures and policies to improve the licensing process through Part 450, but also at the same time looking at how to improve Part 450. Oh, I want to actually mention on the ACs, we do have, we put together what we call a Tiger team to better prioritize the throughput of ACs and AST. So we're really focusing on that. We're trying to get these things going. And if you go to the next slide, oh, before we get to ACs, go to the next slide. Yeah, the next slide is about ACs. Just a couple of things on future rulemaking. So we have two sparks going on currently. There's the Part 440 spark on financial responsibility. I think that's one thing that's very clear in that world is there is a lot of changes we can make to that particular part. It's not the sexy part of spaceflight, but it's a really, really important part. And we're having some great discussions in the spark, and we're looking forward to starting that rulemaking. We have the other spark on Part 460, human spaceflight. That just kind of got started, and we're just starting to work in the working groups. You know, I think there's been a lot of great discussion about safety frameworks in general and what the mix of government and industry should be. You know, how and when that leads to a rulemaking is still up in the air, of course. But it's been a great discussion so far on that spark. And like I mentioned, Part 450, we are starting to get that going. Okay, next slide. So here's the published advisory circulars. So we have 18 of them. And I think the one I'll just point out is the one on the very bottom there that we just put out a week or so ago, maybe last week, the launch and reentry of space nuclear systems. This is an AC that we've been working on for many years, actually. It's hard to get it's hard to get the nuclear stuff right, but it's even harder to see how that fit into our licensing process. The way we have Part 450 is we handle the launch of payloads that are nuclear space systems on a case-by-case basis. And so this AC means the compliance to get through the Part 450 licensing process with a nuclear payload. And just the hazards are different with nuclear stuff compared to what else is in Part 450. So that should now we really have some guidance out there for folks to start knowing what to do to get the launch of nuclear space systems approved by us. The next slide. And these are some ones we're currently working actively. There's about 15 of them. And the other thing I'm going to point out here is that first couple, that first one, guidance on a complete application. I'm sorry, oops, that's an old slide. Oh shoot, where'd it go? Okay, that's an old slide. There's an AC we're going to put out soon called guidance on complete application. And so our licensing team spent a lot of time going through each regulatory requirement line by line and given in a table form the type of information that we want to see in a complete application. So it's really meant to be a lot of guidance for applicants, and we think it's going to be a really big help. And that should be out really soon. We're almost done with that one. And the other things to point out here, you'll see number 8 and number 12 are revisions. So we've already started to revise ACs that we've already issued, one on trajectory analysis and one on hazard areas. And you'll see in the next slide, we can go to the next slide. These are some other ideas that we have for advisory circulars. These aren't as far as long, but you'll see also some more revisions of other ACs in there. So I think we have a good body of work out there now, but we have a long way to go to get the complete list of ACs out there for everybody. So, and that I believe is it. Any questions?
Thank you, Randy. I really appreciate that. It was very thorough. And I just want to say, to the AST team, I really appreciate you doing this. I haven't been engaged with COMSTAC that long, but I don't know that we've had this sort of like debrief from, on previous recommendations. So I appreciate you putting this together and really spending the time to walk through this with us. I think it's really helpful. And I agree, you know, when we walk through task 2, I think it's going to be really helpful to have this kind of exchange going forward. So thank you so much for putting that together. What I might suggest we do, Randy, if you're available to kind of stick around as we continue discussing this, is sort of merge the Q&A in with the task 2 discussion, because what I'd like to do is any feedback or questions that go back to you with respect to your presentation you just gave, I'd like to start using as sort of the, you know, some of the responses to task 2. Because I think they kind of go hand in hand. So if you're okay, just kind of hanging on the line, and we can sort of combine Q&A with the task 2 feedback. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
So I'll kind of kick things off here. You know, one of the things that I observed, and I have to admit that as chair, I'm highly sensitive to what we're asking this group to do, because the last thing on earth they have is extra time. So I do want to make sure that we are tasking this group with things that are going to be valuable to them and to AST. So I think, you know, going forward, and we can talk through the spring tasks here in a few minutes, I do think, you know, there's going to be a lot of value to industry in working through some of those tasks. But I did make an observation on some of the recommendations that you presented, or the responses to the recommendations, is there weren't a lot included with the human spaceflight task. So I know that FAA had to deliver the report to Congress just a couple of months ago, but I don't think COMSTAC's response was included in that. And I'm just curious, like, if that's the case, why wasn't it included? And are there some of those points, some of those recommendations that are still sort of being discussed internally within AST, or do you have any more to share on that topic?
I defer. Is Jim hat on?
Hey, Karina, just to clarify, the question is the COMSTAC feedback based on the Human Spaceflight Safety Framework report to Congress. Is that the one that you're talking about?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Is Jim Hatt on to help?
Yeah, Jim's the only one with an answer. You know, we can certainly ask him that. Oh, there he is. Oh, maybe just popped up.
Yep. Sorry, I was in the back room. That green room. It takes a minute to come back out on stage. Yes, those recommendations. Some of them we're still working on, and several of them were addressed with the report. So sorry I didn't include those on the presentation, but what we can do is we will go walk through those and put that forward to the COMSTAC members for those recommendations as well.
Okay, that's helpful. Do you happen to know if the COMSTAC report will be shared with Congress as well, or were you just intending to send FAA's response?
Our requirement was just to send the FAA's response, but the COMSTAC report is on the website, and I know that the congressional staffers and all have had access to it and have accessed that report as well.
Okay, that's fair. All right, thanks. Thanks for clarifying that. I really appreciate it. So
Sure.
we'll just kind of stand by for some of the additional responses to those recommendations. That's great.
Yes.
All right, so what I'd like to do is just kind of open it up, but I want to make sure that if folks have questions for Randy based on either of those recommendations, advisory circulars, anything else that Randy presented, let's make sure we get those out in the open as well.
I have a question, Randy, on the ACs. Do you all have a process for soliciting and integrating industry inputs into the development of the ACs?
Like I said, once we put them out, we ask for comments. But I think your question is, while we're developing them, do we see industry input?
Try to skip a step, basically.
Yeah, no, that's a good
compress
question.
the process.
The short answer is is not really. And Jim, you might have a better feel for this.
Yeah, at the moment we don't. And when we started this process, since it was all on, or mostly on Part 450, and industry didn't have any real good sense of what was, we didn't. But that's a good question, and I will take that back as I'm taking that as a kind of a recommendation. I'll take that back and see what we can do and potentially include industry input. But absolutely on the revisions, at the back of every AC is a form you can fill out, or you don't even need to fill out that form. But if you send in that recommendations for revisions, absolutely, we will make sure that those get adjudicated and put out in the next revision.
And I will say, if I recall, I think the first 5 we did under Part 450, we had I think we briefed it to the industry. I think we did seek input at the draft stage. It's just such a lengthy process. We thought we'll never get any ACs out if we continue this way. I think so. Part of it, we're trying to balance, trying to get the ACs out as fast as we can with, so. But I do recall those first few, we did do quite a bit of industry engagement first.
Have you all contemplated ways to accelerate the process of developing the ACs? That's one question. Second question is, do you have a prioritized list of which ACs you're turning to next and kind of a timeline? I saw the full list, but sort of have you articulated in any public way or to industry partners the roadmap and timeframes surrounding upcoming AC development?
So we do have a roadmap. We prioritize within AST what we're going to work on next. What was your first question about the?
Have you contemplated ways to shrink the time to
the time, yeah,
develop an issue?
Like I said, the struggle we have in AST, I think I mentioned this, is that most of the people we need to write these ACs are the folks
working on licenses. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so we try to balance that, right? And as you know, we're delayed on the licensing right now, so we do the best we can because we know it's one of those chicken and the egg things. We know, hopefully, if we have a full body of ACs out there, that ideally the licensing process goes smoother. But we got to take people from licensing to, right? So we're trying to balance that. So it's a careful balance.
Could I add just one other quick thing on the kind of streamlining piece? We are working with MITRE, one of our FFRDCs, and they have a pilot project right now where they are working on developing advisory circulars as well as using machine learning, AI potentially to help develop them more quickly. And then also making them more accessible so that they aren't PDF documents, but they're actually hyperlinked, embedded videos, etc. And once we get that pilot process going, I think those two things will also help make the advisory circulars be put out more quickly. And I believe the previous slide that Randy had showed is the prioritized list of upcoming ACs. We're expecting to get about 12 more this year. So that the top 12 there will be the ones that we'll be working on next. And if we can get more out, we will certainly do that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, Jim's point about the working with MITRE is, a paper AC is a very 20th century thing. So we are trying to be a little more modern on how we provide guidance to applicants.
Thanks, Randy. Karen, go ahead.
Thank you. With regard to the plans for updates to 450, which you mentioned, Randy, I'm curious if you're planning to put out a like an ANPRM or / RFI for inputs regarding 450. And certainly COMSTAC's provided its recommendations, but those are in some ways limited to the members of COMSTAC and the inputs that they have, and we have a broader base of interest across the industry in 450 and probably experience that could, be brought to bear on updates. I certainly, we can look at other space regulatory regimes and see where that was really beneficial to the updates and the outcome that they had, and wasn't something that was done for 450. So wonder if that's something you're planning to do here, and something that allows you to gather information without a particularly high burden of effort until, of course, you start processing that and drafting the regulation, but might actually diminish the amount of work by virtue of having industry do some of that work for you.
Yeah. So we're trying to figure out the best way to engage with the industry on this. Because our options are, like you said, we can do an AMPRM, we can do a public meeting, and there's different ways to do that. We can do Spark, but that's a big effort, and we can work with COMSTAC, and we can work with individual companies to get individual input. So we're trying to figure out what the best way to do that, because and maybe you all have some ideas about a Spark, when you have the time, is a really nice way to do this, but we're trying to figure that out.
Well, even a Spark, if I may, Karina, even if a Spark has a limited, membership,
Yeah.
and is usually given tasks with specific questions, which puts the burden on FAA to develop the Spark membership, to get a charter for the Spark, and to develop the task or the questions for the Spark, versus now I just lost my words.
AMPRM, yeah.
Yes. or which is essentially an RFI, request for information from industry, kind of that diminishes the burden on you to identify interested parties, allows any interested parties to come forward because of the public notice piece, and gives you the opportunity to then understand what some of the key points are that might help you feed into developing a Spark, or moving into drafting at least a draft NPRM, which you could then share with industry and get inputs on, or share with a Spark for then inputs. Like there are steps in the process that I think by virtue of the expedited approach to 450 were not utilized, that are available to FAA, and that might, like I said, relieve some of the burden and garner a result that is representative of across industry's interests.
Yeah, no, that's good input. There really is. We'll think about that. We haven't done an AMPRM in a long time, but maybe that's the best vehicle for this particular issue. So thanks, Karen. It does take time, though. AMPRMs, it adds a bit of time to the process.
Any other questions for Randy regarding presentation? Anything else we want to note at the moment? Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, Randy, I just wanted those first two slides. I kind of took them to read that FY23 dollars satisfied staffing resources for growing licenses. I want to make sure we're not taking that away as a talking point.
No.
My sense is that you've got that 24 and beyond probably need additional resources to keep up that load, and I just want to make sure that isn't misinterpreted.
No, what I was trying for human spaceflight, for the work we're doing with standards, research, doing the things in the human spaceflight area. That is what we got in 23. But no, as far as the licensing work we're doing, that's a different issue.
Okay,
can I just follow up on Mike's point there, which is a really good one? Did the fact that you hired 10 new staffers to work on human spaceflight out of the additional resources you received decrement your ability to hire additional licensing personnel?
Well, I mean, the appropriations we got was for 10 human spaceflight folks. So, some of the folks that we hired are actively involved with licensing to understand the licensing process better and to help out. Plus, there's human spaceflight going on with licensing. But Congress, when they give us money for a certain purpose, they're going to ask, what are you using that money for? And there's people. And so if we hired the 10 people and just threw them on licensing without any kind of human spaceflight work, that'd be a problem.
Just a point of clarification. It was not my understanding that there was a dedicated call for additional human spaceflight personnel. What are you referring to there, Randy?
That was in FY23. The appropriations we got in 23 was for 10 additional, to hire 10 people for human spaceflight, and about $1.2 million for contract work. Once again, to go into to research and this, standards development and the work we're doing with the Spark. That's we're working there too.
Yeah, I mean, so Matt, that just if I could sum it there, I think perhaps I'm not sure what the vehicle is for this, but some follow up on that direction. I mean, I think that's something where my sense is that the less the FAA needs its staff for a whole bunch of different areas. I know a lot of efforts from the Congress have been focused on licensing. I think understanding that there's specific direction for specific types of staff versus others. Maybe worth discussing. Maybe table that and sort of think of the best platform for that, or if that's something we talk about at COMSTAC in a future meeting, as far as kind of our advice to Congress. But that's just interesting to me, kind of as you described, Randy. So thank you.
Yeah, it's also an interesting point that I think you can't have human spaceflight without a licensed vehicle, and so to me the direction to focus on human spaceflight, I understand the support for the Spark and some of that work, but any effort, any entity that is licensed to fly people, whether it's on launch or reentry, is going to have a 450 license before anybody gets on board that vehicle, one way or the other, right? So it seems as though that is I would posit that there's a defensible point here to be made, that those folks being engaged in making sure that we have a functioning licensing regime is in support of human spaceflight.
Yeah, we would tend to agree with you on that.
Yeah, excellent. Randy, I also think it would be interesting, and I understand if you're not in a position to do this now, but I think a really important point for us all to understand, especially to this conversation about engaging on resources, as I think you've seen various ones of us or various representatives from folks on the call do recently in very public settings, advocate for resources and efforts for the agency, as well as, by the way, I want to make sure I say an appreciation for the hard work that everybody's doing to try and operate under the constraints that they're dealing with. And that is I think, we have some amount of data, pretty limited, on the performance under 450 versus performance under traditional, the former licensing operations. And we see vehicles that are flying consistently and still under the prior licensing regime, and very few that are flying under the new one. And so I think, to the extent that there is data that is available to the COMSTAC with regard to the amount of time that individual licenses are taking now under 450, and the resources, the difference in resources between like prior licensing regime and the new licensing regime, I think would be pretty helpful to our efforts to talk about resource needs at the agency, as well as the importance of being able to address those challenges.
Yeah, and of course we do measure to some extent the time it takes to do an application, and we're trying to improve that. Actually, we're trying to improve our staffing models to have a better feel for what effort the average license application takes. But you're specifically saying that compared to 417 versus 450, ideally we'll get 450 down to the same amount of time it took before. I mean, I don't think the plan was not to make 450 harder. There's some growing pains for sure that we can fix, both with rulemaking changes and for process changes. But ideally, 450 won't be, the burden that it currently is in the near future.
Yeah, I'm quite concerned with what I see as it looking like a hindrance to newer entrants, and that it's affecting potential competition among providers, launch operators, by virtue of the fact that a new vehicle getting through one regime is facing a different burden and amount of time as a new vehicle faced getting through the prior regime. And that's concerning as we try to support a robust launch industry in this country.
Yep, fair enough. Like I said, we're trying to improve the 450 process.
Yeah, absolutely. And we want to understand how we can most support you in getting that done.
Yes. Yeah. And like I said, when we will be engaging very shortly with you and we've already got some feedback from the industry on parts of 450 that could need some adjustment, and we'll continue to do that. And one thing I'll say, I on a side, whenever I know we did Part 450 fast, and that was a challenge, and it kind of shows a bit. But whenever you do something that big, also, there's always going to be some growing pains. And I think one thing we've learned as an agency, whenever you do a major rulemaking, whether you do it fast or slow, when it first hits the street, you're going to find problems right away. And so we need to always make, in our planning for rulemaking, always plan to do another rulemaking right after it, and Delta rulemaking to clean it up. And even we took our time with 450 and didn't get it out till 2026, there would have been growing pains, and we'd be doing another rulemaking anyway. But I think there's no question about it. We gotta get this thing done pretty quick.
Thank you, Randy. Anybody have any other questions related to recommendations that were just presented? Anything else?
I'll just different from 450 Ray. I wanted to thank you and the AST team for continued support on America's Rocketry Challenge. So, many on the call here are all supporters. It's the world's largest student rocket contest. Finals are held in Virginia. The U.S. team goes against the French, UK, and Japanese teams for the global title. So it's a great partnership and a really important STEM activity that FAA has supported. And so, just thank you for that continued support.
I belong to the Rocket Club that hosts that. So, yeah, it's a great event.
Randy really launches rockets.
That's great. All right, thanks so much. So, Randy, if you do want to stick around, I think it'd be helpful if we can get the slide deck back up and just have the task 2 presented here. What I've been doing during this discussion, during this Q&A, is just sort of jotting down what I'm hearing from you all. And it's very clear. It's licensing by far is the biggest challenge. When we start to talk about, economic, technological, institutional developments relating to commercial space transportation, that's definitely the one thing that keeps coming through is how can we help the FAA make some of these improvements to the licensing process? So those are some of the things that I just started to jot down here. But when we think about task 2 and some of these other, challenges and COMSTAC's priorities, what other items do we want to discuss here and work on in terms of I'll probably just do the same thing here. I'll submit a white paper on this task, but I wanted to get some of your thoughts out in the open first. If nothing beyond what we just discussed, we can kind of just focus in on that, on 450 licensing challenges, some of the other challenges. I jotted down some of the ACs, Matt, to some of your comments on ACs as well. So we can start to draft it based on this discussion. And if there's anything else folks want to either chime in, or we'll just get something circulated over the next couple of months.
Yeah, this is Mike. I'll jump in here. One, not to switch off the 450 discussion if others want to dive in there further, but I think an area that I think there's growing interest in is on nuclear space systems. We have the AC that Randy talked about. I think those folks that are working in this area are really interested in what got put out by the administration a couple of years ago in SPD 6, and AST probably has a real leadership role in making sure that SPD 6 sort of becomes the new rules of the road. So I do see that as an area where we may have some work where we could be helpful to tease out some guidance.
That's great, Mike. And that's a great lead into our spring task that we want to propose. So we can flip 2 slides ahead to the proposed spring 2024 taskers. All right, so I'd love to just get some general feedback, yes or no, are we in the right direction here before we get these officially approved by AST for our spring taskers. The meeting is going to be sometime in April, so we have plenty of time to work through these. So the folks that are on the call, I know we're missing some, but Karen, if you can kind of read through the regulatory working group and just give us some idea if this is something your team wants to take on over the next few months. I know Mike Moses is absent, but Michelle, I think Michelle's still on, and I know Matt's on. Anyone else from the safety working group? I want to kind of read through these two. By the way, these two taskers for safety working group, I've been talking with Mike Moses about, so he's aware of these as well.
Yep, this looks good to me, Karina. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Karen.
Yeah, and I would say the same for the safety working group. I think it looks good.
Excellent. Thank you, Michelle. Any comments from the rest of the group on these tasks? All right, if not, we can move to the next slide. And I think we still have Sita with us, right? And I know we don't have Moraba with us today.
Yep, still here.
Excellent. So we've got one proposed for the R&D working group here. And then I know we still have George and Melanie from I&I. If you guys want to read through these and just see if you're comfortable taking these on.
Yep, I'm aligned with it. I think it looks good. Ready to take it on.
Excellent. Thank you.
The I&I one looks good as well. Just for completeness, there was one other idea to put in the hopper at the appropriate time, I think, and that is start thinking, talking about, and working towards point-to-point transportation. What does that mean? What's broken? What needs improvement? What needs to be discussed in order to not hold up the developers and operators when they have their technology ready to go?
Yeah, I completely agree, George.
Yeah,
Agree as well.
George and Karina, I agree. Yeah, this looks aligned with one of the recommendations that we put out of the I&I working group in May also. So thanks.
And Matt, did you have something?
I was just agreeing with George, as I often do, on the point-to-point stuff.
I'm definitely not opposed to giving you guys more work. If the I&I working group wants 2 tasks as opposed to 1, I'm definitely in favor of that, but I just want to make sure that you all can take on the workload. You're going to be down an additional person since Ed is moving off of the COMSTAC as well.
I think it's appropriate to put it on the list, and we'll see how far we can get.
Okay, we can do that.
Karina, this is Dale. I agree.
Awesome. I love the enthusiasm. Okay, fantastic. Well, we'll continue working with Brian on finalizing these tasks and get them out to you all as soon as possible. But you should have ample time to work through them. Okay, any other questions with respect to any of the tasks we've discussed or proposed spring tasks before we start to wrap up the meeting? I know we do have a public comment period, but I don't think anyone has signed up to speak. Is that correct, Brian?
Yeah, that's correct. I have not received any formal public comment responses or opportunities to speak in accordance with the Federal Register notice. That time the cutoff was November 5th, so still didn't have any in the last couple of days, so over.
Excellent. Well, we'll definitely give you guys some extra time back. I know a couple folks had to drop off at 3, so hopefully this is good timing. But I just want to say again, thanks to everybody for your attention, for all of your hard work this past year. I think these tasks will be very valuable to you all and to AST going forward. So again, just really appreciate everyone being here today, and much appreciation to AST for providing this feedback on prior recommendations as well. I think that's a really good thing to sort of incorporate into the COMSTAC meetings in the future. Mike, any closing thoughts?
I want a second just to thank you to all members of COMSTAC for the time spent on the activities. but also as well to the FAAST team for taking the time, and briefing the responses. If we can make that a regular practice, I think it's really important for the work that gets put into it. But finally, just want to thank you, Karina. Just want to thank you for your leadership just this year and as well as last year and the year before vice chair position, but really keeping us on track. Sort of as different people flow in and out of various roles on the membership. It's your steady leadership has been vital to having these meetings go forward. So just thank you so much.
Too kind, Mike. All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you in April, hopefully in person.
Thank you, Karina Dries.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all support staff, and this meeting's adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.